They opened the suitcase. There was the charred remains of what appeared to be a human body.
Opening my contacts book for the first time to reveal the secrets of what it really takes to be a murder detective.
Denied access to basic human living, like having a wash and eating. And so those videos were really haunting and will stay with me.
On the front line, exposing how we solve the most heinous of crimes.
This was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this in terms of the prolonged torture of a human being.
Welcome to Secrets of a Murder Detective.
The murder of Sophie Lyonnais in September 2017 was one of South West London's most harrowing cases. I'm meeting with the senior investigating officer to understand exactly what happened, the pressures, the setbacks, and the methods they used to bring the killers to justice.
My name is Richard Leonard. I am a former Detective Chief Inspector from the Metropolitan Police, and I served 30 years as a police officer. This was a particularly distressing case and does have an impact, because you just don't forget things like that, and they live with you, and they come out sometimes. Most of the time you can suppress it, but something will happen and you'll remember it, it'll take you back to that time.
Richard, good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Cheers, thank you.
Richard, we're talking about September 2017. What role were you fulfilling at that time? What was your job?
So at that time I was the DCI in charge of the murder team.
So a call came in and it was related to a body that had been found. What were the circumstances around that?
Emergency which service?
I remember it vividly because it was actually my birthday. When I was actually at home, I had literally just blown out the candles on my birthday cake. Call came in from the DS running the homicide assessment team car, said, we've got a call to Wandsworth, and what we've got is we've got a dead body in a back garden. The first call came into the fire service. A local resident had walked past the back garden and seen smoke billowing over the wall. Thought that was a bit odd. Fire brigade arrived, knocked on the front door, no answer, but there was a side gate to the garden, and the fire brigade went to the side gate, found that it was open and walked in, and what they was met with was a male who was stood by a barbecue, and there was meat that was on the barbecue that was cooking, but next to the barbecue there was a fire which looked like garden debris, leaves, and the fire brigade came in and put that fire out. It was only as they were due to leave that one of the fire officers was a little bit suspicious about what had happened, went back to further examine the fire, and it was then when they removed the leaves, they saw that there was a suitcase at the bottom of the fire, and when they opened the suitcase, there was the charred remains of what appeared to be a human body.
I mean, that must be gruesome for them. They weren't expecting that.
No, no one was expecting that.
I mean, these are really unusual circumstances, aren't they? What are your thoughts at that time? What are you thinking?
Yeah, it appeared to be very sinister. But you're then thinking, okay, well, we've got a scene, let's lock that down and let's start from there.
So your officers arrive at the house. What is it they're confronted with?
The whole entirety of the house and the garden is now a defined crime scene. This is a murder investigation. We have an unknown body on the fire, so we now need to start the inquiries in terms of trying to identify who that person is.
And how they ended up in that suitcase.
Absolutely.
So one of the priorities for your team now would be to speak to the occupants of the house and get an understanding of what's gone on.
Yeah, so what we've got is we've got a male there who was found by the fire officers, and he had given a very loose account of what was going on and what had happened. So automatically you're then thinking, is this a potential witness or is this a suspect?
What was his name?
He identified himself as a French national called Wissam Madouni. He stated that it wasn't a human body in the suitcase, but it was the remains of a lamb that he was trying to cook. Obviously, what we had found was contrary to that. It appeared to be a human body, heavily charred, missing some body parts. So he was arrested on suspicion of murder. At this point, a female called Sabrina Coudier, who identified herself as being the person that actually lived in that address, came back and asked what was happening and why the police were there. She suggested at that point she had no understanding of the circumstances or what was happening in that back garden. She stated that all she knew was that Wiesem was meant to be having a barbecue in the back garden with his friends, but knew nothing more than that. She did, however, disclose that she had an au pair working for her called Sophie, and Sophie had disappeared 3 to 4 days earlier at the weekend. Maduni had now been arrested, and it was about Sabrina. How do we treat Sabrina? Is she a witness? Is the account that she's given plausible? And the account that Sabrina has provided doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It feels like there's a distinct fabrication in terms of what she's telling us, and she's already identified to us that her nanny au pair has been missing for 3 to 4 days, and as a result of that, Sabrina Coudier was also arrested on suspicion of murder. Sophie was a French national who lived at the property, who was the nanny. Sabrina stated that Sophie had allowed Mark Walton into the address whilst Sabrina wasn't there, and she hasn't given any account in terms of how she's gone missing. So automatically, I'm thinking, is that Sophie in the suitcase?
Sophie était une petite fille rigolote, qui a toujours eu le sourire, et très timide aussi. Je m'appelle Catherine Debout, je suis la maman de Sophie Lyonnais, jeune fille au pair à Londres. Elle voulait se lancer dans le monde du travail. Donc une de ses copines lui a montré cette annonce.
Sophie was from the northern part of France. She was from a family that were not that well off. They had a modest way of living, and she had come to the UK to make money, to make a new life for herself. My name's Tristan Kirk. I'm the courts correspondent for the London Evening Standard. She came over to work as a nanny for predominantly Sabrina Coudier, but also Wiesem Maduni. They gave her somewhere to live, somewhere to be based on. And from the outset of that move, it seemed like a good thing for her, some way to find a new life and some prospects.
She was really looking forward to her new job. She loved children, and she was really, really excited about what was going to happen next for her.
Your officers have closed down the house and it's now a crime scene. What would be the next steps in this early stage of the investigation?
The first consideration is to search the address, and there is nothing that belongs to Sophie in that address, even though we know that she'd been working for Sabrina. And it wasn't until that we searched the shed in the back garden that we found a suitcase that had the belongings, female clothing and some cuddly toys in there, which at that point we believed to belong to Sophie. And mobile phones have been recovered from both Sabrina and Wiesem, and part of the investigation was to download the content of those phones to identify if there was anything significant on there that could assist or move the investigation forward. In terms of removing the body to the mortuary, the focus was trying to identify who the body was. So it was incredibly important for us to begin the post-mortem process and obtain a DNA profile from the body to try and identify who it was.
When most people die, a post-mortem will take place, also known as an autopsy. For the majority of cases, that will be a standard post-mortem conducted by a pathologist. Where there may be somebody to blame for a death, for instance in a murder, a special post-mortem will take place, and this will be conducted by a forensic pathologist, somebody who's had extra training to your normal pathologists.
The post-mortem was conducted, and there's two primary focuses on the post-mortem. One is to identify the cause of death. The second is to identify who the body is. We were unable to specifically identify cause of death at that stage. What we did have was we had fractures to the ribs, broken sternum, and fracture to the jaw, but we weren't able to establish whether those injuries occurred either before death or after death.
One thing the forensic pathologist would have been able to establish was the gender of the person.
Yes, so we were able to confirm that the body was a female, and we were working on the premise that the body was that of Sophie. There's a number of things that are pointing towards it being her. We'd already started making inquiries through her family. Initial inquiries we had revealed they hadn't spoken to Sophie for a number of weeks.
Le 19 septembre 2017, on est venu frapper à ma porte en pleine nuit. Et quand j'ai regardé à l'œil de ma porte, j'ai vu des policiers. Donc à partir de ce moment-là, j'ai commencé à voir mon cœur qui s'emballait. J'ai ouvert la porte et quand j'ai vu ces policiers, je me suis dit, c'est Sophie, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Il y a eu quelque chose à Sophie, dites-moi. Alors ils m'ont dit qu'ils avaient été contactés par Scotland Yard dans la nuit. Ils m'ont dit, madame, il faut vous asseoir. Et à ce moment-là, moi j'étais toute seule, donc ils m'ont dit, voilà, votre fille, il arrive un drame, elle est décédée. Elle a été assassinée.
So one of the important elements of the post-mortem is to identify who this person was. So under normal circumstances, the way that would be carried out would be a visual ID, wouldn't it? You'd have a friend or a family member who knows the victim well, would come to the mortuary and visually ID them to say, yes, that's the person I know, and name them. That wasn't possible in this case, was it?
No, the nature of the injuries and decomposition to the body caused primarily by fire damage made that impossible to do. So DNA was the only way that we could positively 100% confirm that was Sophie Leonette. We was able to obtain some deep muscle tissue, even though the body was heavily charred and there was not a lot remaining of it. And from that deep muscle tissue, we managed to raise a full DNA profile.
You would need a reference sample, some kind of DNA to be able to compare the two to say, this is Sophie. How did you go about achieving that?
So we actually did it through familial DNA, so through mum. Mum came over and we got a DNA sample from her, and we was able to do a comparative against the sample we developed from the deep muscle tissue. But there was another way that we were reasonably confident that we were on the right tracks because the body had a ring which we managed to recover, and we showed Mum the ring and she confirmed that belonged to Sophie.
That must have been really hard.
It was really difficult.
J'étais complètement perdue, je savais plus. Je savais plus, c'était le trou noir autour de moi. J'étais complètement dévastée.
Weiss and Maduni, Sabrina Kudo were both interviewed. Maduni denied any knowledge of what had happened. It was put to Sabrina about the body that was found in the back garden. She 100% stated that she had no idea of what happened in that back garden. All she seemed to be wanting to talk about was Mark Walton. nothing more than that. Sabrina stuck to her story that Mark Walton had colluded with a now missing au pair. She has no understanding or no awareness of where Sophie is, but 100% stuck with the story she provides about Mark Walton.
So an important step now for your investigators is to look at Coudier's account and establish whether there's any truth to it. What did you find out?
So Mark Walton was a music producer. Transpires that he had been a founding member of Boyzone. Mark was incredibly open with us and very, very transparent in terms of his relationship with Sabrina. In 2011, they began a relationship he described as being infatuated, besotted by Sabrina when he first met her. She was someone who craved the limelight and craved being around famous people. So she would often be seen at social events.
We get an early indication of the volatility of Sabrina's personality from Mark Walton, who tells a tale both of a very intense relationship. He talks about being crazy in love, but then a very paranoid and volatile and unstable individual emerging in that relationship. My name is Professor Donna Youngs. I am an investigative psychologist and criminologist at Northumbria University in the UK. These are early indicators of somebody with this kind of emotionally unstable personality. Unwittingly, what Mark did when he broke off the relationship with Sabrina would have been her worst nightmare. Because not only did he withdraw the contact with celebrity and with the money and the comforts, but he also rejected her.
Their relationship finished pretty acrimoniously, and Sabrina became very obsessed around Mark, and she started making allegations about Mark to the degree that she reported it to the police. And it was investigated. Mark was actually arrested in relation to those investigations, but there was no foundation to any of the allegations that Sabrina had made.
So in a way, it seems like she's almost putting Mark Walton up as a potential suspect, if indeed this is a murder as it looks like.
Yeah, so obviously Mark Walton has been introduced to the investigation as someone of interest to us, even though the allegations that were made appeared to be incredibly outlandish and extravagant. He was incredibly transparent with us and shared lots of information with us. He shared his phone records, phone data, which proved that the allegations that Sabrina was making against him were completely unsubstantiated. But what was really interesting was that Sabrina started to embellish a bit more on the account that she provided in regards to Sophie and Mark Walton. And now she starts to tell us in interviews, she was quite open and very talkative, and starts to make reference to the fact that Sophie was allowing Mark into the address and that they were drugging Maduni, Sabrina, and that Mark was sexually assaulting them. So she's starting to talk about something that is completely implausible, but also what she's starting to do is she's starting to give a story where you could potentially see that she has an issue with Sophie.
So she thinks she's being clever, really, by talking her way out of the situation. But in reality, she's giving you more information, more ammunition against her, because she's giving you a motive.
Yeah.
So having got them to commit to a story, an account on tape, your team now then went to the Crown Prosecution Service. What happened when you did that?
So a CPS authorised charge for murder for both Sabrina and Wiesem Maduni.
Getting over the barrier to get somebody charged is lower than it takes to get someone convicted at court. Is it fair to say that if the evidence you had now wasn't improved, there may have been a chance that at some point the Crown Prosecution Service may have dropped this case against the both of them?
I think the vulnerability was Sabrina, because a good defence counsel could potentially say that actually when she was being interviewed she wasn't of sort of fit mind because of the nature of what she was saying. So yeah, there was a real challenge, but again, maybe there's a perception that once you've got someone charged, then you're home and dry. You're not. That's pretty much the beginning of building your case to take it to court, because it's got to be, you know, pretty much bulletproof when you go to trial. On the 3rd of October, we got the news that we was expecting, but there was confirmation that the body in the suitcase was Sophie Leonette. The DNA profile came back and confirmed a match with her mother's, and you know, we now know who that person is.
In terms of your investigation, it was now important that you understood the life of Sophie.
So what we found out was that Sophie had come to the UK approximately 18 months earlier. She'd lived in a small village north of Paris, quite a quiet person, quite introverted, but saw this as a massive opportunity to come and work for someone, and to sort of develop her language skills in English.
She's trusting of authority, and she's an introvert, which psychologists know means that she's highly trainable, particularly by figures of authority.
I think Sophie was very vulnerable. She was in a house with limited network, if any, in the outside world, and reliant on the couple who were putting her up to help her out, and they did anything but.
Clearly, in a relatively short space of time, probably within the space of about 12 months, became a literally living nightmare for her.
As well as establishing details of our victim, it's important to establish details around the relationship with the two in custody. What did that tell you?
What we managed to clarify and establish was that Sabrina and Wiesem first met when Sabrina was sort of late teens, early 20s, and he was 5 years older than her. But even at that point, even at a young age, it is clear that Sabrina is very much the dominant partner in this relationship, and it's very, very toxic, very dysfunctional.
Sabrina addresses her inner sense of emptiness coming from a difficult and disrupted childhood by creating in her head delusions of grandeur, a narrative of her own specialness, and this idea of herself as in some way different, in some way special, was facilitated, was allowed by the world because of her beauty. And by the same token, by winning her, Maduni got his own sense of value, his own self-esteem by being her boyfriend.
They were in a sort of on-off relationship. She then had a relationship with another individual. Then they split up. 2011, we know that Sabrina got into a relationship with Mark Wharton, and that was on off for about 2 years. And then in 2014, that's when Mark stops support for Sabrina, and it appears that Maduni's then come back into her life.
When they were together, they combined into a toxic combination. This was a couple who played off each other, seemingly, and when one person went bad, then the other followed.
Part of the investigation was about understanding the background to Sophie and her interaction with the family. Sophie was essentially working morning, noon and night. She was cooking, she was cleaning, she had no time off. She wasn't allowed time off at the weekend. She was essentially a slave to Sabrina Coudier. Approximately 5 months before Sophie is murdered, she speaks with a local restaurant owner and she discloses that she is a victim of physical abuse from Sabrina Coudier, and she's being beaten by Sabrina.
It is heartbreaking because We hear that just a glimmer of awareness that this shouldn't be happening, but not enough for her to make her escape, not enough for her to go to the authorities, to face up to them, to tell anyone who might really have been able to help her. Just shows us how worn down emotionally, psychologically, and physically she was.
It got to a stage where Sophie wasn't allowed to leave the home. She wasn't being fed, and Sabrina had told Sophie's mother that she had opened an English bank account where Sophie was being paid into. That was a complete lie. There was no money there. Sophie was being kept captive in Sabrina Coudier's house.
She had become, by this stage, a mere object, an object under their authority, an object for the expression of their own anger and fury.
We also became aware that Sophie's phone had been taken away from her. She had no money, she had no means of getting back to France, she had no means of communicating with her mother to tell her what was going on.
So eventually, in this case, I'm assuming you would have got some phone evidence back. How long did that take and what did it show?
Yeah, the phone evidence took quite a long time actually, because we had to send the phones off for what's called a full digital forensic download. So essentially taking everything that's in that phone on the memory and downloading every file, every audio, video file, call data, etc., etc. Originally, he was looking for either some significant communication between Wiesem and Sabrina on the day that the body was found, which would potentially show some collusion between them. But actually what we found, on Maduni's phone there was 3 video files, and on Sabrina's phone there was 22 audio files. And what that showed was a continued barrage of almost like psychological interrogation of Sophie, where she is continually asked about this obsession that Sabrina had with Mark Walton, how he's coming into the address, and Sophie's involvement and what she was doing. But the most harrowing stuff that came out of that was the video files, because what that showed was a significant physical deterioration in Sophie. And those final video files we had of her showed her as being emaciated, looked like she'd been sleep deprived, and just a constant bombardment of questions, the same question over and over and over again. And it literally pushed Sophie into submission to the point where she'd kind of given up, and she started, she was admitting to letting Walton in to the address, pretty much, I think, to try and get them off her case, to leave her alone, because she was completely and utterly broken at that point.
I mean, that paints a really harrowing picture of Sophie's last days and hours, really, doesn't it?
It was really hard watch. The audio and video files, what they showed to us was that the torture had been going on for a number of weeks, up to 6 weeks prior to her death.
It was all about completely dehumanizing her. It reveals individuals who have an absolute empathy deficit, who are completely egocentrically focused.
And then we know on the 18th of September that at this point Sophie is in the bath. Now, by looking at those images of Sophie, she was incredibly frail, and that kind of we managed to understand actually how those injuries were received. Her body must have been lacking any physical resistance whatsoever, and her bones must have been incredibly brittle, so any pressure put on her would have caused those fractures, and she just did not have the strength to fight back at this point. I'd been in the police for 30 years, I'd worked homicide for 16 years, and this was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this in terms of the prolonged torture of a human being.
So as hard as it was to see these videos, in terms of the investigation, This was a real turning point, wasn't it?
It was significant because what that showed, the fact that obviously we've got the video files on Maduni's phone, that implicates him within this kind of interrogation, but it literally drew in and really beefed up the case against Sabrina and showed us her involvement and how she was fixated that Sophie was implicated and a willing partner in allowing Mark Walton to abuse her and Maduni, completely and utterly based on nothing other than her own obsession. But yeah, it was really created a strong case against Sabrina and it was a real turning point. So at this point we have a very strong prosecution case against both Wissam Maduni and Sabrina Coulier regarding their involvement in the murder of Sophie Leonette, and we went to trial on the 19th of March 2018.
When multiple people were responsible for somebody's death, it's really important that detectives can establish the different roles each has played. And that will become really important by the time they get to court. The jury will want to understand, well, who did what? So you reach the stage of the trial at the Old Bailey in central London. When there's more than one defendant, it can introduce an interesting dynamic into a trial, can't it? Especially when people start blaming each other. We refer to it as a cutthroat, where their defence is, it's not me, it's that person. Is that what happened in this case?
So originally Maduni was quite happy to take the rap, so to speak, or take responsibility for what happened. He admitted that he had Sophie in the bar, but stated that he didn't intend to kill her and was suggesting that it was accidental and almost eliminating Sabrina from any involvement. But 4 or 5 weeks before trial, he changed defence counsel. That individual looked at what Maduni was saying and clearly had a very objective, rational conversation with him about the implications for him taking full responsibility. So it was a case of now Sabrina was involved, and it was essentially that Wissam Maduni is fixated and obsessed by Sabrina, but she was the driving force behind all of this.
They did turn on each other in court. Sabrina Coulier said that Wissam Maduni did the murder, and vice versa. Both of them said they were out of the room at the time that Sophie's life was taken away.
So the trial lasted just over 2 months. It was very challenging. There was a lot of media intrusion, particularly from the French media. And there was also something that I've never really experienced ever before, where you have, when one of the defence, i.e. Sabrina, is giving evidence in the witness box, you have Wissam Maduni in the dock, and they are shouting at each other across the court, which is unique. I've never ever seen that before. So it created a kind of a bit of almost a farce type situation. You're meant to control yourself when you're in court. And it's the emotions clearly got the better of them. So Sabrina, she stuck to her guns that it was Maduni. She stuck to the account that she had provided all the way through about Mark Walton and how Sophie was allowing him into the address. And the stance that her defence took was that this was an irrational obsession that she had that drove her actions, and almost as though she wasn't in control of what happened, but she was assessing it was proven that she was fit to stand trial, and that actually she wasn't suffering from a psychosis, which would have potentially meant that she had a loss of control. So yeah, it was an interesting trial, but one that was incredibly distressing for Sophie's family to have to sit through.
Was Sophie's mother present during the trial?
She was present during the whole trial.
So she saw all this?
Yeah, so she witnessed the whole thing.
So is that everything she's been through? I mean, court is hard enough for families anyway. To have to witness this charade must have been awful.
Absolutely.
Losing a child in any circumstances is bad enough, but this It's beyond words, isn't it?
Yeah, it was really tough. And one of the really difficult conversations with Mum was that she wasn't able to see Sophie, which is probably some of the only kind of sort of solace they get is in terms of being able to see their loved one at the mortuary. But because of the nature of Sophie's body and the damage that had been caused to it, they could not do that. So they never ever got to see her.
And say goodbye.
Yeah.
One of the centerpieces of the prosecution's case were audio files and some video files, actually, that had been made by the killers themselves. Very unusual situation where the killers have actually created and kept hold of the key evidence in the case against them. And in court, they played those tapes to the jury to spell out quite how bad it was.
Il y a eu des preuves qui ont été montrées sur grand écran, des audios aussi qui ont été entendus, où j'entendais ma fille et Sabrina interroger ma fille à travers des claques, des hurlements. Et ma fille, d'une voix très faible, dire je ne sais pas, je ne comprends pas, je n'ai rien à dire. Et vous entendez derrière Sabrina qui frappe ma fille, qui la gifle.
The videos particularly were upsetting. They showed Sophie very much towards the end of her life. One of the tapes I remember was probably within hours of her being murdered. And before she came into contact with this couple, she'd been a normal, healthy young girl. When we saw the videos of her just before her death, it was really distressing to see, to be honest with you. She was really gaunt. She'd been starved, denied access to basic human living, like showers, having a wash and eating. And so those videos were really haunting and will stay with me.
Mais quand j'ai vu Sophie dans un état dramatique, mais j'ai hurlé, j'ai pleuré. On ne voyait plus que la peau et les os. Je veux dire, son visage était amaigri, mes bras, c'était ses jambes. C'est très dur d'une maman d'entendre des choses pareilles et de voir sa fille, comment elle a été traitée.
There was an enormous pile of evidence as to what had been going on. After the murder had taken place, there were various pieces of evidence to show rather odd behaviour from the two people who were responsible for this killing. Both Coudier and Maduni went out in public. Coudier went to a trampoline park. Maduni went to the shops. They didn't appear troubled by anything that was going on in their lives. They were acting normally, perhaps then building themselves an alibi to show that their lives had continued normally. But in reality, there was a body in their house at home.
The jury comes to a decision.
Both were guilty of murder. Both were guilty of destruction of the body, and they were given a life sentence with a minimum 35 and a half years in prison.
So that's 35 and a half years before they can apply for
Absolutely,
parole.
yeah.
How did that feel for you personally?
It's justification in terms of the case. It's justification in terms of the prosecution. But it leaves a bit of a bad taste in the mouth in terms of the way that Sabrina and Maduni conducted themselves in court, and a complete lack of sort of contrition and emotional empathy with Sophie's family, the way they both behaved, it was completely unacceptable.
Et quand la sentence a été prononcée, tous les deux, ils se sont regardés, ils se sont retournés vers moi. Et surtout elle a dit, mais c'est pas moi, j'ai rien fait, c'est pas moi. Et moi, quand à ce moment-là, j'étais debout, je l'ai regardée et je lui ai dit, si, tu n'as que ce que tu mérites, si c'est toi, maintenant tu vas pourrir en prison.
This was clearly a difficult investigation, not in terms maybe of proving the case, because as murder cases go, the evidence was there, it just needed to be found. But the emotional toll that this case clearly took on you and your team. From me, on behalf of Sophie and her family, I'd just like to thank you for the work you and your team did.
Cheers, thank you.
Maduni and Coudier received life imprisonment with a minimum sentence of 35.5 years. Now, in terms of prison sentences in the UK, that's definitely on the upper end of the scale. And that definitely reflected the inhumane and outrageously evil way they treated Sophie in those last days, hours of her life. For me, it was probably as good a sentence as I would have hoped for, and hopefully for Sophie's family, it's one that they can take some comfort from.
Moi, au jour d'aujourd'hui, j'ai plus ma fille. Je peux plus lui dire que je l'aime. Je peux plus la prendre dans mes bras. Sophie, franchement, je t'aime de tout mon cœur. Et je suis désolée que tu sois au ciel. J'aurais préféré que tu sois avec nous. Mais bon, je t'aime quand même là où tu es. Et j'espère que dans le ciel, tu es entre de bonnes mains.